And thank you for a really incredible conversation and thoughtful remarks earlier today. It was really illuminating and inspiring and thought-provoking. And our goal is to match up to that. And I know that we can do it. I'm Nitsan Chorev. I'm a sociologist at Brown University. I'm at the sociology department as well at the Watson Institute. And I know that if this is not working, it is working. So I don't have to speak as loud. Okay, thank you. The panel this afternoon, or right now, is going to discuss possible roads to a decolonial sociology. And I really do think that this is a very, the right approach to the questions from the earlier panel, in the sense that it was a very open-ended panel and we didn't really have solutions, or we didn't come to solutions earlier in the morning, and now we are going to talk about what possible solutions there are. I will introduce the speakers, and then we'll leave time for the talks and then for discussion. So the first speaker is Katrina Quisumbing. She is an assistant professor of sociology at Northwestern University. Katrina studies racial classification and exclusion from a historical perspective that focuses on the way state actors conceive of and make decisions around race and citizenship. In the US context, Katrina studies how the state defines colonized populations and how these people fit into the US racial order. Now, Katrina's writings is very relevant to the discussions today. I will just mention two pieces that she wrote recently. One she edited and wrote the introduction together with Alexander White for a special issue on global and historical sociology of race and racism that was published in Political Power and Social Theory. And she also contributed to the Oxford Handbook on W.E.B. Du Bois called The Global Color Line and White Supremacy, Du Bois as a Grand Theorist of Race. The second speaker is Zophia Edwards. She is an associate professor of sociology and Black studies at Providence College. Zophia's research examines the impacts of colonialism and multiracial labor movements on state formation and human development in the Global South, with a particular focus on resource-rich countries. Zophia also recently published pieces that are very relevant to the discussion today. One of them that was published in the special issue that Katrina and Sasha edited, called Applying the Black Radical Tradition, Class, Race, and a New Foundation for Studies of Development. And a different piece is on post-colonial sociology as a remedy for global diffusion theory. Finally, Paget is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at Brown University. His specializations include dependency theory, Caribbean political economy, Africana philosophy and religion, race and ethnic relations, post-structuralism and critical theory. He wrote many books, including ones that were mentioned earlier, Caliban's Vision, Introducing Afro-Caribbean Philosophy, and he co-edited C.L.R. James's Caribbean. He's also the editor of the C.L.R. James Journal and co-editor of the Routledge series of Africana Thought. So he keeps himself busy. So, Katrina.
Okay. So thanks to Jose and everyone for organizing this event. I'm really happy to take part of this conversation. And it's both just having it in person. I was saying to Jose at the break that the dynamism of an ongoing conversation throughout the day is really exciting. And I hope that we will be able to address some of the questions left open by the first panel, though I will preempt that I do not have a clear path toward decolonial sociology. I was on a panel last week that it was called Solving Empire, and nor did I have an answer to that question. But nevertheless, I'm happy to be here and take part in this conversation. And I'm going to depart a little bit from in thinking about decolonizing sociology, not to talking about the canon or theory, but thinking about sociology a little more generally. So I'll say to start that I find marking and taking this road to decolonial sociology is complicated by my own social and geographic position, by my privilege and training, as well as by the stage of my career. And I'll return to thinking about biography a little more generally in a bit, but here I'm trying to think about and model what it means to think about the personal and the political. So even though I find talking about myself in this way terribly awkward, I'm going to present you with a bit of who I am, and I'm doing so as a humble and hopefully provocative model of what it means to think about our social position and the implications of that for the project before us. So in short, I'm raising questions about who am I to decolonize sociology and what role can I play given my position? And I believe that these are questions that we should all have to contend with. So I was trained in sociology in the United States, and I'm a professor at a similar type of institution, an R1, albeit a private university. And these facts shape what I can see and what I know. At the same time, I find myself in many ways to be a perpetual outsider or foreigner in the United States. And this isn't just a personal or social matter, but a professional one, and I'll speak to the latter. So as a non-white person who studies something related to a non-white place, it's hard for many sociologists to see my work as sociology. When choosing my dissertation topic, some of my committee members expressed concern that I might end up shying away from my chosen topic for this reason, that I might not be seen as a legitimate sociologist. And though I'll note that while I study the Philippines and US colonies, I actually study the white Americans who created social problems in these places. And so actually I study the United States, but people often don't see it this way. So I'm sure that many of us have been asked, what is sociological about your project? How is this sociology? And of course, as a junior scholar working on one's dissertation and making sense of the data, these are important questions to figuring out the broader implications of one's work. At the same time, I'm sure that many of you know that not everybody gets asked this question. So I'm both incredibly privileged and I experience some outsider within status based on my ethno-racial origin and also what I've chosen to study and based on how these things intersect. Yet, if I'm an outsider within, this doesn't necessarily mean that I'm an insider in some other place. For example, I'm not a national of my parents' countries of origin and I wasn't educated in the Philippines. And I'll return to these questions of biography again at the end of the talk, but I've awkwardly shared some of this to emphasize the importance of social and geographic location, and to think through what vantage we have as individuals and as people in the US Academy, and what we can offer to the project of decolonizing sociology. And this is a question that indigenous, transnational, diasporic, anti-post-colonial thinkers have wrestled with for a long time. And it's no mistake that people who find themselves in the borderlands and in complicated relationships to the white metropolitan academy have offered important critiques of epistemology, theory, and methodology. So for the rest of this talk, I want to raise the question of why and perhaps how we should decolonize sociology. And this means attending to first what sociology is, or what it offers, and then what decolonizing could possibly look like. And so again, I'm speaking a bit more broadly here than the curriculum. So if we can agree that sociology is the study or science of the social world, I think that many of us who are attracted to sociology or wrestling with how attracted to sociology we may be, it's for its attention to empirics. At least I can say that for myself. That we can make observations about the world around us in a systematic way and use this to say something about society. So without getting too much into the practice of disciplinary boundary drawing, I'll say that personally, I'm confronted about what it means to decolonize sociology, I do find myself wanting to defend the relationship of theory and empirics that we have. As an undergraduate who stumbled into a gender and society class in my first year, sociology gave me a language that fit with the way I saw and understood the world. It helped me name and understand systems of power and connect those to the things that I saw around me. And I'll just say that this was largely through Patricia Hill Collins' Black feminist thought. And it helped me place my observations in conversation with the systematic observations of others. So it strikes me that if we aim as sociologists to explain and describe the social world, and the social world is laden with hierarchies and inequalities, then we must have something to say and do in response. Sociology does have something to offer the world, I hope, but it's not without its problems. If I could perhaps oversimplify The problem with white metropolitan US sociology, it's that it narrowly conceives of the social world in a way that not only obscures but reinforces hierarchy. And many people in this room have written a great deal about this. As an extension of this, sociology hasn't been so good at seeing itself as constituting and also shaped by the world around it. Many, like Raewyn Connell and Julian Go and others before them and outside of sociology, have argued that we need to decolonize theory and knowledge. This isn't just a matter of representation and inclusion, but of gaining a better and more complete understanding of the world. For example, if we only understand capitalism from the position of the European wage worker, we miss how colonialism and enslavement supported the development of Europe and the United States. So we could reach toward perhaps a less normative understanding, to use some of the language of the earlier panel. And if our goal then is to decolonize sociology, and again, not just about the canon, that's just one site of enacting decolonization, then I think if we want to decolonize sociology at its root, this means having a more capacious understanding of what constitutes the social. Implicit in this broadening of our conception is the broadening of our conception of social problems that we want to address and the research questions we can ask about them. So one simple way to do this, very simple, is to recast social problems. This is along the lines of what Giordano was suggesting. Not as problems of racial and ethnic minorities, as once, and I think still is, the title of many introductory classes on race and ethnicity, right? The problems of racial ethnic minorities. So rather than problems of black and brown and yellow people, these are problems that are produced by privileged people in power. So this is a problem of power and power relations. And I'm really not suggesting anything novel here. Many quantitative scholars who have already been pushing against the dominant variable model or variable approach by conceptualizing race as a variable, not just explaining differences in educational attainment, for example, but as a measure of institutional racism, and also by further exploring what interactions create and maintain racial inequality. So rethinking problems not as individual issues, but as problems of power. So decolonizing sociology then means rethinking what constitutes the social world, reframing existing problems, and asking different kinds of questions. Super easy. So yeah, not such a straightforward task. But by now I expect that things like adding Du Bois to syllabi is not where we think the road to decolonizing sociology should end. At this point, we've talked about Du Bois a lot, I think, and I think he's perhaps better thought of, as many of you do, I know, as an entry point for other sociologists. His exclusion, his biography, his sociology show us the importance of valuing different kinds of knowledge, questioning power, creating spaces for different perspectives. But if not just Du Bois, then what? So I'm going to return here to biography and underscore some complications that biography and reflexivity might raise for the project of decolonizing sociology in a way that doesn't just add more people to the canon. So I've been suggesting, as we've learned from Du Bois and feminists of color and many others, that what we know depends on our social and geographic location. This then raises a few questions for us. Who has epistemic authority on what kind of topics? This goes back to Ricky's question. Given the realities of transnationalism, diaspora, exile, whose voices do we privilege? If we can understand that the insider-outsider, metropolitan, peripheral divisions are not actually clear-cut, then whose voices are the most important? More concretely, for many of us in this room, how does our position in the US Academy, even if we are marginalized, oppressed, or excluded populations, shape what we know and the kinds of questions that we ask? Something that I think about a lot as someone who studies the Philippines is, do people back home or living in communities of origin have a more authentic standpoint on some topics? So Spivak's writings are suggestive on these questions. For example, we cannot automatically assume that the native knows. We cannot substitute the colonized for the colonizer, which I think speaks to some of these questions about the center. And instead, perhaps we could consider our social locations and what kind of knowledge we are capable of generating and under what conditions certain types of knowledge may be more reliable. I'll close with two examples that perhaps can provide partial solutions to these questions that I've raised. First, it's that I found it meaningful to study those in power, to make them the object of analysis. Again, I'm not suggesting anything radical or new here, but I want to emphasize what it can mean to study up in light of a decolonizing aim. So Said characterizes Orientalism by its exteriority to what it describes. Reflecting not on the position of the white metropolitan intellectual, but of themselves, Du Bois and Ansel Dua speak of double consciousness, a mestiza consciousness. So how can people who are outsiders within or who sit at crossroads then leverage their conditioned and imposed exteriority to study systems that have shaped their social location? This isn't to replace the authority of the colonizer with that of the colonized, but to think that there's something valuable to be learned from the vantage point of the colonized and to be learned about the colonizer. This changes the relationship of subject and object, providing new knowledge about the social world. And this is what whiteness studies does, for example, of which Du Bois is a great example. Souls of White Folk, which Michael mentioned, is my favorite essay by Du Bois. It's amazing. So if you haven't read it, I really suggest you do. It's a really great example of what it means to sit at this position and study white people and have a certain vantage point on them as someone who is oppressed. At the same time, we cannot assume that the knowledge that I gain, for example, about how US actors leveraged arguments about the racial unfitness of Filipinos to stake a claim to global power, that knowledge that I have speaks for Filipinos by virtue of the fact that I study the Philippines or by virtue of the fact that I'm part Filipino. So while speaking of and while speaking for cannot be separated, given my biography, we also shouldn't conflate the two. So then this leads me to my second example, which I think almost goes without saying, that we must include more voices because it reduces the likelihood of homogenizing or essentializing experience. So here I'm thinking a little bit about what it means to address past erasures in this moment. There should be more space for local, heterodox, anti-colonial, indigenous knowledge and methodologies. And I'll give an example here, which is not from sociology, but before I started graduate school, I worked for an indigenous NGO in Peru, and one of the projects I supported was a global indigenous assessment of climate change. In 9 pilot communities, and in partnership with the UN and other European organizations, but largely just using their money, indigenous people addressed problems of climate change that faced their communities, and they used indigenous ways of knowing in doing this. So the concrete task was to assess the effects of climate change on the livelihoods of people and on future possibilities. But more than that, the project raised questions about knowledge, about how one acquires it, how do we know what we know, and how can knowledge be put to use in solving social problems. Members of the project considered what kinds of tools could be used to gather information they sought about climate change and sustainable futures. They asked fellow community members about the measures that mattered to them in everyday life. They used traditional methods of visioning the future, including reading coca leaves in Peru. They collected oral histories of community change. They read traditional agricultural calendars and assessed if the ecosystem was in line with the predicted cycle. This project was led by indigenous people. It was envisioned by them. It was informed by their everyday concerns and problems. They gathered data to understand the world around them with the goal of bettering their conditions and identifying systemic drivers that threatened their livelihoods. So while not a sociological undertaking per se, this project offered indigenous science, I use that very loosely, in that I'm being critical of Western science, not that I'm being critical of indigenous knowledge here, and it offered a decolonial approach to knowledge production. So then the question for someone like me is, how can our research activities support these kinds of projects or initiatives in communities or places back home? How can we create space for more alternative viewpoints, not just from non-white, immigrant, post-colonial, or diasporic communities in the metropole, though I'm sure that this is important, I wouldn't deny that, but from people in places with fewer resources? How, through dialogue, can we make the questions of the periphery or the global south or indigenous communities legible to the discipline at large? And this speaks to some of these questions that we had about publishing and the pressures of publishing and of being in the discipline. How can these perspectives from these places and people challenge and reshape our existing frames, theories, categories, and methods? And I think that this is the task before us for a larger project of decolonizing sociology. Unfortunately, I don't yet have very good answers to these questions that I've raised, but I think it starts with reflecting on our own privilege and position, even as people who find themselves at times or in many ways marginal to the discipline, academia, and perhaps more generally in the heart of empire. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katrina. Zophia.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jose, for inviting me to speak at this event, this important event. and to all the organizers, the faculty, students, and staff who organized. And Katrina, for those amazing comments. I'm actually going to pick up on some of the things that you talked about in your presentation. And so hopefully, it'll be, sort of an interesting conversation to kind of build on some of those themes. So the struggle to decolonize the curriculum or decolonize disciplines is a long one, right? Calls to decolonize disciplines and curriculum emerged from global anti-racist, anti-imperial, anti-colonial, global liberation movements to decolonize countries and institutions and minds. It came from the colonies, from Latin America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, and also within the core, when we think of movements for Black studies and movements for ethnic studies and so on. And now, in this particular moment, the current move, this current wave to decolonize curriculum and to decolonize sociology are specifically located in the metropoles. It is coming largely from within North American settler colonial countries and European academia, and also in South Africa, right? But predominantly within the metropole. You do not find the same thrust to decolonize sociology in this present historical moment coming from among the populace or academics even necessarily in the periphery. This is mainly being articulated in the metropoles. We're having this conversation at Brown University, one of the most elite institutions in the US and, because of global capitalism around the world. So what is the thrust in the academy outside of the metropole? I'm going to focus on the Caribbean because that's where I'm from. So Caribbean academics are part of a mobilization for reparations. The Caribbean reparations movement, organized by CARICOM, is a social movement. And Caribbean academics are a part of that movement. It is articulating the legal, moral, ethical case for the payment of reparations by governments of all former colonial powers and relevant institutions, including institutions of higher education, in those countries to the people of the Caribbean community for the crimes against indigenous genocide, the transatlantic slave trade, and racist chattel slavery. So like calls to decolonize universities and education systems and curriculum, mobilizing for reparations also has a long history rooted in anti-racist, anti-colonial, and anti-imperial struggle. The decolonial-minded sociologists in the metropole today might support the reparations movement, and the Caribbean scholars in the Caribbean today obviously support decolonizing the curriculum, but I would argue that these two conversations are happening largely separately. So is there a potentially fruitful way to bring these two conversations together? Is there a fruitful intersection that we might explore, and what might we gain from doing so? The project of decolonization, right, to dismantle colonialism, the pursuit of freedom, independence, autonomy, and self-determination is intimately linked with reparations. And universities in the colonies or former colonies are key sites for reparations. And so I want to see if we can bring this into a generative conversation today. And I think we can because thinking about reparations alongside decolonizing the discipline helps us to address the material. It also helps us to recenter the struggle to decolonize as a struggle against racial capitalism. And it helps us to elevate, picking up on what Katrina's talking about, the demands of people and communities outside of the metropole. So first, dealing with the material. Sociology is colonial. Julian Go, Zine Magbani, Ali Meji, and others have told us that, sociology was institutionalized in the metropoles as a formal academic discipline during the height of imperial and colonial domination. George Steinmetz talks about the consolidation of British sociology during the period of decolonization in the British colonies. And they worked, these sociologists, to reproduce colonial difference and colonial domination and coloniality in multiple ways, using the colonies as data pools for their racist imperial imaginations. They were involved in aiding colonial administrations and so on. And within this context of decolonizing sociology, the conversation has mostly revolved about how to address the epistemological injustices, that is, correcting the exclusion of certain authors and certain paradigms and methodologies, or transforming understandings. And it is important to correct knowledge and ideas, but we must also recognize that knowledge is produced out of an infrastructure that where status and wealth are accruing in one place through the active dispossession and extraction of wealth in other places. So we need to also repair historical wrongs, not just epistemologically, but materially. That is, then, to dismantle the structures that advantage those in the core and disadvantage those in peripheralized regions. Sociologists in the metropole get funding and institutional support to go out into the world and collect data and formulate ideas. For over 100 years, historically benefiting, and today benefiting from the dispossession and extracting from communities and scholars in the periphery, while at the same time, sociology departments and professional organizations in the global north create boundaries, excluding scholars from the peripheralized regions. So thinking about reparations helps us to address the harm in tangible ways. The reparations movement in the Caribbean, for instance, demands the development of community institutions, such as research centers. They call them community institutions, which I think is really interesting, right? Research centers, museums, an African knowledge program, science transfer, technology transfer. So reparations becomes a way to decolonize methodologies, knowledge production, the buildings, the workforce, and so on. And so, you know, we can think even of the example of the University of Glasgow, which reparations money has gone towards establishing the Glasgow Caribbean Center for Development Research to study the history and global impact of slavery. These are real concrete ways in which resources can be channeled from sociology departments and professional organizations in the metropole to the periphery in the spirit of decolonizing the discipline. The second piece I'll raise is addressing decolonization or decolonizing the discipline through reparations also helps us to recenter the system of racial capitalism. Colonialism is one of the modes of oppression within racial capitalism and imperialism, and racism is fundamental to that. The objective state of affairs is to do with racism and capitalism and imperialism, and its agents teach what they teach, and they produce the kind of knowledge that they produce from that structure and for that structure. But the thrust of the matter of decolonizing sociology might focus on racism and colonialism, but decolonizing for what? It is for the establishment, the colonial sociology was for the establishment and maintenance of capitalist social relations and the expansion of capitalism into every realm and every corner. So what is being taught then is capitalist ideology, and that is what we need to fight and delete and dismantle. It's the enemy of the working people everywhere and academics everywhere. And sociology was and continues to be committed to racial capitalism. There may be some individual sociologists who identify as socialists or communists, but as a discipline, as an institution, sociology celebrates and perpetuates the system of racial capitalism. The sociology of development, for instance, continues to conceptualize development as emulating or resembling the metropole. The birthplace of democracy is still considered to be the US or Western countries and not Haiti. So you have some version, we can have some version of decolonial sociology that exists quite harmoniously in the capitalist neoliberal university, in the racist capitalist core. And we have to be very careful of that happening. We have to be careful that a decolonized sociology doesn't remain wedded to the logics of racial capitalism. And when I say the logics of racial capitalism, I mean in the sense of valuing scholarship, in the terms of this scholarship should be valued at the same as this scholarship. I think we can easily fall into that or remain within those boundaries. The Caribbean reparations movement is not just about valuing lives. It's not just about compensation or inclusion or representation. Rather, it is about challenging the terms of racial capitalism. It is about justice and transformation, securing the funds to build Black and Indigenous institutions for Black and Indigenous people, including investing in research that benefits the masses. So it's not just an intellectual project or an intellectual conversation. It is about survival and thriving. And in the early days of independence, universities were seen as primary sites in many former colonies, trying to repair the harm done to people. The decolonized university and the decolonized social sciences in the former colonies were part of nationalist development projects. They decolonized personnel and the curriculum, yes, and they were also centers for understanding the historical development of those countries and incubators for designing new political economies. So it is dismantling colonialism, but also building new futures. And so today, the demand for reparations aims to get the resources to build the consciousness and capacity for Caribbean people to invent and realize their own future. So the challenge, I think, is to always link racism and colonialism to capitalism. And therefore, to create a decolonized curriculum means to create an anti-capitalist curriculum. Can we do that in the university setting? The university is a corporate entity. This is why Fanon says decolonization is violent. Would sociology departments survive if they adopted an anti-capitalist sociological stance? Finally, bringing in the conversation on reparations into discussions of decolonization elevates the voices of those who are marginalized now, today. It allows for efforts to decolonize sociology in the metropoles to forefront those organizing to make similar and overlapping claims in the periphery. Because it's similar to what Katrina said, to what extent can we produce decolonial anti-capitalist thought in universities in the core? Who gets to do that when thinkers abroad need visas to enter into the US and to work in the US or in other parts of the metropoles? When they can be targeted and deported for anti-racist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperial work. So within this context, it's crucial for decolonial sociology to turn to the periphery. What do people under coloniality of power really want? What kinds of knowledges do they seek to produce? And in that way, we might link, a decolonized curriculum to reparations, which is what the Caribbean reparations movement is asking for. Just one other factor that I think we have to consider, which is really important in all of this, is as we turn to the periphery, we have to also consider who do academics in the core engage with when they engage in the peripheralized regions of the world. Who is the local? The colonial education system was created to create an elite and a laboring class. And nationalism is very important in filtering decolonization. Fanon talks about this, right? The national bourgeoisie co-opts decolonization for its own interests. And the national bourgeoisie and the educated intelligentsia. So are we engaging a local intelligentsia who are acting in the interests of global racial capitalism, or are we engaging the subaltern? I'll just recall that Walter Rodney in Guyana was driven out of the universities in his own home country and from other Caribbean countries for his attempts to decolonize the curriculum, for his anti-capitalist decolonial work by the national bourgeoisie and some of his own colleagues. And so as we think about decolonizing sociology, we have to be really mindful about which classes we are collaborating with and to what ends. So I'll just end with, decolonizing a discipline is calling to decenter, destabilize, but I want to also draw attention to redistribution. Reparations is calling for redistribution, and we should consider reparations as something important on this road to decolonize the discipline of sociology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Zophia.
Okay, I think I'll stand. I'll get through this faster. So I'll stand with you.
Standing will go make it go.
Okay. The birth of our discipline, sociology, is inseparable from the rise of the modern phase of human societies in the early 19th century. Something about the breakdown of medieval societies. And just for purposes of conversation today, I will say what was this something about the breakdown of these societies was the collapse of the dominant centers of medieval society. What were the foundations of discourses in medieval societies? And in particular, I will emphasize God. That if we look at these societies that modernity is going to transcend, the metaphysical core of these disciplines was the belief in a supreme being of a spiritual nature. The collapse of this created a metaphysical vacuum. And that metaphysical vacuum opened up the spaces for many alternative centers. That at the foundation of Western metaphysical philosophical thinking, we are going to get new candidates to replace God. The economic, the political, race, gender, industry, et cetera, right? So this is what Sylvia Wynter calls the de-godding that comes with the birth of modern society. And this de-godding of pre-modern societies opens up the spaces for new centers. Now, by the late 19th century, right, what we have are at least four new centers of thought that are going to inform the rise of sociology. In other words, four systematically developed lenses that will come to define the discipline of sociology as it emerges in Western Europe. First, we have Marx's lens of the progressive commodification of social life and the exploitation of workers and colonies. Second, Weber's progressive rationalization and industrialization of social life, and the techno-bureaucratic iron cage that it threatened to produce. Third, Durkheim's progressive secularization of social life and the threat of normative decay, or anomie, that it posed. And fourth, in the 19th century, we have Du Bois's lens of progressive racialization of social life and the race-based inequalities and exclusions that this was going to give to modern societies. Now, the main reason why we are, one of the reasons why we are here today talking about the decolonization of sociology is precisely because this racial colonial lens of Du Bois was excluded, right, from this founding canon. And he was excluded and separated from Marx, Weber, and Durkheim because he was an African American. This act of professional exclusion was also an act of colonial racial exclusion. It reflected very directly the internal colonial status of African Americans. Using his sociological imagination, Du Bois linked biography, history, social structure to fashion with rigor and great evidence this racial colonial lens, right, that was still bubbling up inside him, even though it was being denied recognition. Right? And in reality, what we got is that in spite of being colonially and racially excluded, right, for so many decades, Du Bois developed this lens so well, right, that it has now re-emerged as this major factor in the current call for a decolonizing of sociology. And of course, for the emergence of this new trend, we have many scholars to thank, but in particular, Alden Morris and our own Jose. Yeah. And let us not forget into Katrina. And I could give you little biographical details of interest here, but I don't have time. You know. Now, this contemporary decolonizing challenge, the contemporary challenge to decolonize sociology, right? The one that we are confronting now, I want to suggest, goes well beyond the case of Du Bois and African Americans. It includes scholarly work done by many scholarly work by individuals in the periphery, in the ex-colonies, right, who are using the lens of imperialism fashioned by Marx and Du Bois, that as I was listening to both presentations, but in particular Zophia's, the unmistakable Marxian inflection of the critique was just undeniable. Right? So, for me, it is evidence of the continuing relevance of Marx. Right? So, the present moment that we're in, right? Just as the early 19th century concrete situation, right, created the possibilities of these new centers of thought, centers that are governed by the logic of the Western metaphysical tradition. I want to argue that this present moment that we're in is giving us opportunities to develop new centers, and we have to add these new centers to the present sociological canon, right? Now, it's not that they were not there before, right? They were there before, but the structures of domination of 19th century Europe and 20th century Europe, of course, led to their exclusion. Right? So we need not only, in the present moment, we need not only the four lenses we inherited from late 19th century, but we will have to add to these at least two more if we are going to decolonize sociology in the 21st century. And these two additional lenses are, for me, a gendered lens and an ecological lens that we have to be able to add these to the sociological canon if we are going to be speaking to the world that's ahead. As socioeconomic inequality continues to grow, both nationally and internationally, right, the need for the Marxist lens has only grown. In the coming era of artificial intelligence that is about to explode upon us, right, its arrival will only increase the need for Weber's lens of the progressive rationalization of our society. Right? Think about what AI is going to do. Right? You're going to have robots lecturing, sitting next to you in class, taking classes, giving classes, whatever. They are going to transform our society in a very profound way. We are literally going to have mechanical doubles of ourselves, intelligent mechanical doubles that you're going to be talking to, right? And they're going to be answering. And what's frightening about it, every time they talk back to you, they get better, right? This is what's crazy. This is what's progressive about it. And this notion of progressive rationalization, that these machines get better every time they repeat an action, right? Dynamic change. So I think with this in the pike, Weber's relevance persists. And how are we going to think about this impact of this new level of progressive rationalization, I think, is very important. Now, these trends of progressive rationalization, progressive commodification, as in the past, will likely continue to trigger the progressive secularization, the progressive de-godding, if you like, of modern societies, and the normative decay that it has so far produced. Or it could trigger the rise of fundamentalist and fascist movements, as it has done in the past. Either way, right, this point points to the continuing relevance of Durkheim. The racial backlash that followed the achievement of the African American civil rights movement and has now reached its peak in Trumpism clearly demonstrates the need for the Du Boisian lens. Right? That if we thought that the civil rights movement and the election of Obama, right, had changed fundamentally this history of racism, right, and racial capitalism, well, the present moment is clearly an eye-opener. And hence, our need for the Du Boisian lens persists. So what this says to me is that we don't have time now to be arguing who should be included and excluded. We need to bring these four lenses up to date and dialectically bring them together, right? To be able to understand the world that is maybe no more than a decade or two away. Now, this is the society that we have to study. This is the society that we want to say, here's sociology's contribution to understanding. So, but in addition now to these four lenses that we've inherited from the 19th century, right? We must add this gendered lens, right? And again, it's not that this gendered lens was not there before, right? It is whatever the configuration of 19th century European society, it was not permitting it to function as a center. You could not center gender, right? And say this is a legitimate perspective from which to look at society. I think we're in a moment that with continuing struggle, this is what is possible. We can do this if we remain committed sociologists, right? And so now with the International Panel on Climate Change, it's telling us that we are now in code red with our ecological crisis, right? We need to develop this ecological lens, right? That if what they're telling us is true, it may not matter anymore, you know, when we talk about modernity. The project of modernity, oh geez, you know, it just all gets, you know, swallowed up in these ecological disasters that are threatening. It could be a classic case of some of these sociological studies of societies that collapsed due to climatic changes. So this climate disruption that we are going through and our tendency to exclude climate as a lens. Oh, geez, I remember laughing at climate theorists. Oh, geez, you know, and there were so many of them. Well, I think that it's time to change this. That climate, in the present moment, has emerged as a possible center for sociological thought. This is what this moment, I think, is demanding of us, right? So these changes, of course, as I've articulated them here, are at the macro level, right? But we also have to bring them down to the meso and micro levels and to work them through the various structures and levels of the discipline. These 6 lenses must permeate the discipline if we are going to move forward and really embrace the 20th century. Now, the last thing I want to say is that let us reflect on, as we talk about the decolonizing of sociology, and I thought that Zophia's presentation really brought home, is the metaphysical status of our use today of the concept of decolonizing, right? Particularly in the Western Academy. We are appropriating metaphorically a very real process that occurred in the periphery. And the turn to reparations in the Caribbean, right, is the current way that we struggle. But, I mean, I love Hilary Beckles. It's my good buddy. But I don't think reparations is the answer. That we must get back to a broader anti-capitalist, anti-colonial struggle that goes beyond reparations. But in a way, it just brings us back to the metaphorical and the non-metaphorical use of decolonization. Right?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the speakers. I think that all 3 talks really did allow us to expand the way that we ask about decolonization in sociology and beyond by allowing us to think beyond the issue of decolonizing the curriculum, beyond decolonizing theory, beyond what it is that we should read and shouldn't read. But really, I think all of you consider the very difficult question of what does it really mean to decolonize sociology. And together, I think that you exactly moved beyond what it is that we should read, what it is that maybe we shouldn't read, to issues such as what kind of research questions should we ask, what kind of empirical strategies should we use as part of decolonization, and of course, what does it mean and what the implications are in regard to institutions and resources and really the material foundation of sociology. So I really appreciate it. I also saw a bit of tension between Katrina and Zophia on the one hand and Paget on the other hand, in the sense that Paget in some way maybe still maintains, and correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, the relative contribution or division of labor. Oh, we can use Weber for bureaucracy, and we can use Du Bois for race, whereas Katrina and Zophia seems to suggest, and I think that the previous panel as well, that we cannot actually create this intellectual division of labor, and we have to incorporate whatever tools that we have, be it race or gender or ecology or, for that matter, Weber, into all questions and all empirical strategies. So I would be interested in your response to that. But now we have around 30 minutes for discussion. So I welcome questions, comments, suggestions.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, yes, I should use my glasses at this time.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm
Hi.
Rivo. Thank you very much. Really great presentations. My question is kind of almost too simple and too obvious, so I'm a little bit hesitant almost to ask it, but I'm going to ask it because I felt like, especially Katrina and Zophia really talked to this in terms of the racial capitalism and reparations, and in terms of the social and geographic positioning. Now, if we take your words, I feel some sort of a paradox emerging, which is this. In a way, wasn't the direct consequence that we are doing something fundamentally wrong here today by having this metrocentric dialogue among scholars only from US top universities? Wouldn't the direct consequence of your approaches be that some of the resources of this event should have gone towards inviting peripheral voices into this event? Or how do you feel about that? Did I misinterpret that? Is that a paradox? I don't know.
We should collect a few questions,
Oh,
three
okay.
questions maybe.
Yes, thank you so much, and particularly, that was really, really provocative. And I had 2-3 questions. One is sort of just the title of this conference itself. Is it Decolonizing American Sociological Theory and Knowledge? Or is it sociology in general, and where are we speaking from and who are we speaking to? Because maybe a little view from the periphery where I'm from, sociology, when it's taught in undergrad courses, you'll have the introduction to sociology, and then you have Indian sociology, and so there is this tension. Why is there a need for sociology that is taught in the periphery to even define Indian sociology vis-a-vis, this dominant notion of sociology? Because Indian sociology has already decolonized itself. It's teaching Ambedkar, it's teaching Gandhi, it's teaching sort of the view from anti-colonial struggles and anti-caste struggles. So we've already done that. So really, thoughts on that, and what the ripple effects of conversations here are having on the way sociology is taught in the quote-unquote periphery. And I think your comments on the material production of knowledge and this practical agenda for change were really sort of where the debate should be. And I think we should be spending maybe 3 more sessions on how we do that. And my other question is that I wonder whether we're in this dilemma because it's an artifact of the way we teach sociology here, the sort of 3 lenses versus 4 lenses versus 5 lenses. That's not how sociology is taught in other parts of the world. We don't have 3 or 4, and therefore the need to expand. So is it an artifact of pedagogy and the way we're teaching? And my final question, is, are we learning more from comparative historical sociology or the sociology of development, problematic as it may be, does that have more to teach us about the core theoretical debates in sociology today than trying to sort of recover the core itself? So just a few questions.
Thank you. Sarah, and then
Yeah, thank you. This was a great panel. I really loved it. My question is actually for Paget, and it's a specific question about what you said in the end. So when Zophia was talking about reparations, for example, if we understand modernity as racialized modernity, which has been constructed through colonialism, what can be beyond reparations? Isn't reparations the way to decolonize? Because racial capitalism is at the core of it.
Katrina, do you want to start?
Sure.
And then Zophia, and then Paget.
I'll try to put some of these together. And so I think that well, actually, I'm going to give you an example of debates between Philippine and Philippine American studies to sort of speak to these questions about metropole and colonial thought. So there's been a critique raised by a number of Philippine scholars that Philippine American scholars or white American scholars educated in the United States only see the Philippines through the lens of empire. And so as somebody who studies empire, I think, oh, it's so powerful to study empire and to name power and white supremacy. But the critique is that that's not all that the Philippines is or has been, right? And that scholars in the United States, including exiled ones, diasporic ones, Phil Am people, sort of have an Orientalist understanding of the Philippines. So I don't think that there's like a right or wrong answer to this, and so similarly, I don't necessarily think, oh, let's all just leave this room and return the money and bring in people only to talk from the periphery. But I think that all of these things need to happen in conversation. Like, this is an important conversation for us to have given our location, but this isn't the only conversation, right? And sorry, there's so many questions. I'm trying to tie them all together. I'm not a very good extemporaneous speaker as well. But I think that I guess I'll answer the other question about like the lenses and what we're taught and how we teach. And I have noticed as well, maybe it's a generational difference, that I don't necessarily think we need to teach theory in a way that is person-centered. I think we could teach it in a way that is like concept-centered, or like we could teach about theories of conflict. And in that way, I don't necessarily think we need to hang on to Marx per se. So what are the different theories of conflict? I find, I don't know how productive it is to teach Marx without an exploration of race. It just is hollow. And so I feel less wedded personally to particular theorists. And this also shows up in mundane ways of like the way you might, as a graduate student, the way you might think about writing a term paper or a literature review, right? So like you start to write one and it's like every topic sentence is somebody's name rather than an idea or a concept, right? And so I find the latter to be more interesting for moving forward conversations than talking about people per se. But that's just my own take. I might have more clear thoughts on this later.
Zophia?
Yeah, thank you all for those questions. Just starting off with the first one about sort of events like this, or these kinds of events. I think it takes me back to sort of what Katrina was describing in terms of people who occupy sort of these transitory spaces. They're moving between the periphery and the core. I consider myself to be one of these people. And I think it is precisely our role in events like this to point this out, right? And so that the other conversations do become broader and necessarily involve more people from peripheralized regions. So I don't see it as sort of an either or. I think, as you're saying, all of this has to happen in conversations, because also the people who are raising even that sociology should be decolonized are people who have been marginalized, right, in academia. So I think it's all important. We just don't want to lose that like crucial element that people from the periphery should also be included. And then to your questions about, are we talking about decolonizing American sociology? And I think absolutely that, you know, in the way we're talking about even the structure of the discipline and how it's taught, we're primarily talking about American sociology. But I wouldn't say, I'm not sure that I will go so far as to say that in former colonies, that the curriculum there are completely decolonized. And I only say that because of, for example, the evidence of Walter Rodney and people who are doing work that really challenges capitalism and local elite sort of ideologies. I think they get marginalized within their home countries as well. And so I think they also, you know, the University of the West Indies also has a lot of work to do in terms of decolonizing the curriculum there. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, yes, I think that these conversations should involve folks from the periphery. But I think we could just broaden it to say that in the present moment, one of the things that we can do more is to deepen relations with universities in developing countries, and scholars in developing countries should definitely be more committed and more in love with their own universities. The history of imperialism has made us all salivate to come to Harvard, Yale, Brown, and places like that. I mean, I can say this without fear of contradiction, that I can mark the moment when the faculty, most of the faculty at the University of the West Indies stopped sending their kids to the University of the West Indies and started sending them to Brown and Yale and all of this stuff, right? So this is a two-way street. We in the developing countries have to learn to love more what we are doing and to think about it to be as good as what's taking place in the center. So we've got work to do too, and Zophia is very right. We are in the process of decolonizing curricula in the Caribbean. Now, and again, if we look at Du Bois, you can see that he was way, way, way ahead of his time. That, that he was deeply involved in reading stuff on India, for example. That the phrase dusk of dawn comes from the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, right? And Du Bois was one of the people who protested when there was this racist reaction to Tagore winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was the first non-white to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And it was just one of the few. I mean, Tagore got no support, but Du Bois was saying, yeah, brother, I'm with you, right? So, solidarity with what's going on in the periphery definitely has to be on our agenda, right? Okay, let me just deal with one last thing. Your question. Is the question I'm trying to raise, why we need multiple lenses, is that we're always trying to center one. We're always saying, okay, isn't racial colonization the foundation of everything? Isn't this the core of capitalism? And I'm saying, look at this. This is a metaphysical question. And you know the problem with metaphysical questions, they're never resolved, right? They catch our imaginations for a short period of time, and then we just move on to the next center, right? That's the way, I mean, if you look at the history of Western philosophy, that is it, right? We're in this period where we just thought the linguistic turn was going to answer all our problems, right? And so many people jumped on board, right? And here we are at the end of the linguistic turn, right? So I think we just need to be aware of this problem of centering and how we get caught up in it, all of these fights and these struggles within the academy and all of that stuff. Look at the Indian intellectual tradition. The problem of centering is has been a much less intensive one. It's something we can learn, right? So when I think of modernity, I definitely see industrialization, technification, secularization. These are all fundamental aspects of what we mean by modernity, including the progressive racialization. I think it's just so important that we learn to talk about this centering that tends to polarize and separate these things and fragment the sociological imagination. I think at the moment, what we need is again, some kind of dialectical integration, if you like, intersectional integration, right? So that the imagination expands. We need to expand it if we're going to deal with the new reality that we're facing. I think that's really my message. To me, it's what also I see, that is so good about Du Bois.
Great, we'll collect a few questions. Yes, Suba.
Oh, hi. So 2 questions, I'll be quick. So the first is, like, as you point out, if you want to engage more peripheries. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
All good? So you want to engage more peripheries, what does that mean for, what challenges does that present to the research program put forth in Decolonizing Sociology? So, so for instance, there's a recent APSR article by Paul Gutierrez, Honor Ulas Ins, who challenges racial capitalism, a term, and how it's rooted in, American studies empire, and he challenges it using the British experience in India. So this kind of challenges are coming through. What does that mean for the research program? That's one. Secondly, as Prof. Edwards, you point out, you want to be careful who you talk to, but can you control what decolonization means outside of this room? So for instance, Ani points out that in Indian sociology is always engaging Ambedkar, etc. That's been going on for a long time. But in recent times, decolonization has been co-opted by the Hindu right. And recently there was controversy when Walter Mignolo wrote a blurb for a book by this guy called Sai Deepak, who's a Hindu phobe. And he retracted it, but that's a tension, there's a problem there as well, and how will we deal with it?
It's not a question, and I'm going to say exactly what Suba just brought up and what Professor Edwards said before. I think we shouldn't be, just to go with Fernand, we should not be so quick to just replace the colonizers with the colonized. The Indian sociology, I've read all 13 volumes of Indian sociology, that is, you can find it. I do not see any Muslim writers. I do not see anything about Kashmir, which India occupies to this day. And so I wouldn't be so quick to say that nationalist and kind of nationalist, methodological gaze necessarily means that they're decolonized. That has its own problems that we cannot just like colonial administrators in India, and you can see this in Nicholas Stark's book, Castes of Mind. Hinduism and castes were institutionalized by colonial administrator and British administrator consultant, the most conservative of
indigenous society to do so. And we have to be sure that when we are when we are collaborating with people, that we are not doing the same. We're not verifying the most conservative, the most reactionary people just because they are from that place.
Thank you.
So thank y'all. This was really great. I just wondered first if you could briefly touch on the irony that as we talk about decolonizing American sociology, the three canonical figures that we have mentioned are European, and the one American is a black guy who was excluded because of race. But a little bit more substantively, Professor Borovoy kind of talks about the last major shift in the discipline as being the inclusion of Marx and happening at a time when the civil rights movement is really taking root in the U.S. It seems like they might have intentionally at that point kicked out Parsons, but chose to keep Weber and Marx. So as you talk about a future, maybe a utopian one for our discipline, who are we, or rather instead of people, what programs, theories, or concepts are we bringing with us, and which might we, because I think we tend to present ourselves as much more malleable than we really are, because of the programs that we were taught, what mud are we tracking in as we walk into the future?
We are going to collect a lot of questions, but don't stress out.
So also, it's more, I guess, of a comment. I think it's a really important point to make about people should fall in love with their own universities and their own things, but there's also a material basis for why people come to the US. And so obviously part of it is about prestige and all of that, but it's hard to fall in love with your university. So I'm South African, in South Africa, if you can't get funding, sorry, I'm always talking too much with my hands. If you can't get funding to do a PhD there, and I think that speaks to what Professor Edwards was talking about decolonizing must account for the material conditions that underscore a lot of this, and that if we're really serious about people contributing in those countries, about developing those universities, there has to be a material basis to that, and we have to think about how the current material inequalities amongst universities reproduce some of those inequalities.
Great.
So I love this whole conversation, but I want to really focus on what Professor Edwards has done. And I think it's productive to break apart Homo academicus from the rest of the world, and to think about the relative success of decolonizing sociology already, coming on the heels of Du Boisian sociology, right? So there's huge transformations within the US around this. But to then think about the ways in which we're reproducing American university privilege through this. So instead of thinking about how these are existing apart from one another, I would love to know, and I'm thinking here of what Michael Borovoy has himself written about the university system in the world, about the ways in which American privilege, Western privilege, continues to escalate. So are there examples where we can point to where, for instance, Watson Institute privilege is used to recenter the kinds of conversations, but more the practical interventions that might allow for the University of West Indies to be more central in a global system of educational inequality?
Anyone else before I? Okay, great. So, who wants to speak first?
Go first in some messy fashion. I'm an external processor, and I don't want to make you all go on this
wild ride with me as I share my thoughts, but here we are. So some of these points about what decolonizing looks like in the periphery, and I think your points about nationalist is not the same as decolonial. And again, to bring it back to the Philippines, a lot of these people who have brought critiques of American scholars of the Philippines have, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Philippines, but they supported the Marcos regime, basically. They wrote defenses of a dictator in Marcos, in the Philippines named Marcos. So it's complicated, and this is why I emphasize that we need to think about our social locations, our privilege, just because you're non-white, or just because you're in the Philippines does not necessarily give you the vantage point to be an all-knowing person or arbiter of what it means to decolonize a discipline. or decolonize academia. And so I think that we have a dialogue around the different valences of what it might mean to decolonize is important, and we don't have control over how that might be taken up, right? But I think one that is oriented toward freedom, toward justice, toward redistribution, and toward the inclusion of more voices, not for representational purposes, but for the purpose of better understanding the social world, of addressing social problems, that is part of the project of decolonizing that us as individuals or us in this room cannot fully understand. I think that, yes, so it's really interesting to me. So, you know, as some of you know, I like Du Bois, right? Like I'm cool with Du Bois. I like Du Bois. I love his writing. I think about him a lot. But it's really interesting to me the way that we focus on the project of decolonizing sociology, in the way that many of us end up locating that in Du Bois or in this moment of Du Bois. And it's interesting to me of like, why now? Why now have we been able to have these kinds of forums and conversations, and that decolonizing specifically, not Du Bois in sociology, but decolonizing gets attached to Du Bois. And I do wonder if there's something about his particular social location and who he is to the American Academy that allows us to do that, that makes it more legible to the discipline as a whole. And so I know many in this room have made this argument that we cannot stop at Du Bois, but I do worry that there's something catchier about him, the convenience with which we can attach him to our existing thinkers because of some degree of contemporaneity? What is the word I'm looking for here? Yeah, so, you know, and there's a convenience there, and the way that these thinkers have shaped what we see as the social, what the problems of modernity are, that confine what we might consider as topics of study. So that's why, for example, I gave the example of indigenous knowledge, that we wouldn't necessarily think of reading coca leaves as a way to understand the world. And I'm not suggesting that we include this in our sociological methods classes, but to consider what might exist outside of the frames that we have about what we think modernity might be, that are Marx, Weber, Durkheim plus Du Bois. Like, why Du Bois? Why not? Why don't we have conferences or books or conversations more around scholars that are from the so-called third world or the periphery?
Yeah, I will also just take up the question of who do we collaborate with, and I think, you know, I agree with both of you. And I was trying to make this point that we have to be so careful when we turn to the periphery and thinking about collaborations, because, you know, Fanon, Cabral, all of these thinkers are so critical. I mean, they warn us about the national bourgeoisie and the local intelligentsia, the middle classes, and they're unreliable, and they co-opt decolonization for their own ends and their own purposes. And so, absolutely, it does matter, you know, even who occupies, who dominates these universities in the periphery, whether that's Hindu nationalism or, you know, some kind of like black middle class bourgeoisie, you know, aesthetic or whatever sensibility or whatever you want to call it. And so, you know, now I'm gonna get really crazy. This is like, you know, so Cabral, for instance, says the way we as academics do that is to commit class suicide, right? So we abandon our position in, you know, our working towards the interests of racial capitalism and colonialism, and align ourselves with the true marginalized people in society, the working people, the true subalterns. And, you know, that is the decolonial challenge, right? And so, I don't know, are we ready for that? I don't know.
Okay.
You have 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me just say, first of all, I think that in the discussion, the different meanings of decolonization emerge very clearly. that we can talk about decolonization as a concrete political, institutional process of change, and then we can talk about it as a metaphor. We are metaphorically appropriating that process. And so it's very important to keep those clear. About what we can do in third world universities, again, to think about what is happening in third world universities, we cannot do this without taking some notion of the progressive rationalization of social life. So that the University of the West Indies now has a global project, a global thing. But it's doing this online. It's taking artificial intelligence, all of this stuff, putting it all together and to develop this global profile. So there's a lot that can be done, and I think this global profile that the University of the West Indies is developing is a good example. But at the same time, here, the progressive rationalization of society is part of this attempt to decolonize itself by going global. And finally, yes, in the Caribbean, it's not just Du Bois. It's C.L.R. James, it's Renee Menil, you know, it's Fanon, Sylvia Wynter, on and on and on and on. So that, that the canon, so to speak, at the University of the West Indies is very different from the canon here, right? So I think these are all important changes that are taking place.
Just actually one point to Michael's question about examples of universities and who have given reparations and what that looks like. Most recently, I can only think of the example of the University of Glasgow, which just gave some millions of dollars in reparations, and much of it is going towards establishing research centers in the Caribbean. But I don't know. I think it's too early to tell sort of how that's going to play out. But I think it'll be really important to look at that and the lessons from that for potentially how this might be done with other universities in other places. Yeah.
So Patrick began his panel by saying it's so nice to see real faces. And I can't agree more, but I don't know that we also expected to get such a provocative, thoughtful conversation that really will, I think, will allow us to think about how to change things. So thank you so much for this panel, and I can't, yes.